Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Global Films Discussion of the Month. This monthly event is hosted by Citizens for Global Solutions in Minnesota every third Thursday of each month, always at 7 p.m. Central Time. It's free and open to the public. We will hear from our guest speaker and then we will open for comments and questions at the end. If you have any comments or questions, you can send them in the chat or raise your hand and I will call you in order you requested. Today, we're going to discuss the Oslo Diaries, which is a documentary that we watched beforehand. It's about a group of Israelis and Palestinians who got together in Oslo for unsanctioned peace talks during the 1990s in order to bring peace to the Middle East. So our guest speaker tonight is our beloved David Schultz. He's a Hamline University Distinguished Professor of Political Science and a University of Minnesota Professor of Law. He's a three-time Fulbright Scholar who has taught extensively in Europe. David is author of more than 40 books and more than 200 articles on various aspects of American and international politics and law. And some of you might have seen him several times on TV as a commentator in several topics, including politics. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, David, for accepting our invitation. Citizens for Global Solutions in Minnesota is honored to have you here. I think we start with you telling us a little bit what you thought about the documentary and of course to share your own knowledge about Israel and Palestine.
Sure. Okay, good. So a few different things. Actually, I want to start with a recommendation, by the way, because several years ago, I mentioned to you, I've been to Jerusalem twice, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about sort of my experiences in Jerusalem at some point. But I was at Hebrew University, in Jerusalem at the Truman Center there. And in the course of the talking to a variety of people, I was asking some people, well, what would you suggest if you wanted to understand something about like the history of the area, of Jerusalem, Palestine, and so forth? And a book that I picked up a few years ago, never read it, but finally giving this talk gave me the motivation to read it. It's a wonderful book by Michael Grant called A History of Ancient Israel. And if anybody's interested, now it clearly has a little bit more, I'm going to say, a little bit of, let's say, kind of a pro-Israeli bias, and that's a little bit there. But nonetheless, what I like about the book is, and this will come into our discussions later on, is that this takes us back essentially to 3000 BCE, before Common Era. And one of the things that it really underscores exceedingly well is how there are incredibly deep historical claims by many groups, not just people who are Jewish or Israeli, in terms of the lands that are there. And there's also incredible richness of history of many cultures, many languages, all who again have legitimate claims to let's say some of the real estate that's there. And the reason why I mention this is that when we start to get to, let's say, thinking about the film, thinking about where we are politically today in terms of Israel, we shouldn't forget that. We shouldn't forget the fact that remember, in 1946, 1947 is the creation of Israel. It's a as a state. Israel was created post-World War II. It was created in part as a safe haven for Jews, after World War II. But it was also carved out of a British protectorate, British lands. And in the process of doing that, uh, many people who are Palestinian, who are Arabic, were dislocated from their homes, from their property. And part of understanding something about the conflicts in terms of what's going on in Israel, both take us back to that ancient history, a land occupied by many groups. And then, of course, since 1946, 47, in terms of the incredible disputes that have arisen out of creation of Israel. And then, of course, after things such as the Six-Day War and so forth, and the movement towards settlements in the East Bank, all have created, I think, an incredible amount of controversy and, let us say, legitimate claims among the Palestinians and with lots of different people. Well, most of us have our Palestinians and people in Israel regarding the same lands here. All right, so I just mentioned this because it's a good book to read and it gives us a good, deep historical perspective. But I want to take us back in time. And the time I want to take us back to is approximately 1978, 1979, when I was in college. And it wasn't too far distant, of course, after the 73 war, where Israel is isolated in the Middle East. You have Israel and Egypt as really arch enemies at that point. And Jimmy Carter is president of the United States, and he brings Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, to Camp David. Camp David being, kind of like the presidential retreat, and nobody knew what was going to happen. And I still remember this scene, that after, I can't remember how many days it was now, that Jimmy Carter announced there was going to be a press conference. And I remember watching it on television with my mother and a friend, and we were stunned to see that Israel and Egypt were going to normalize relationships. That they were essentially going to, Egypt was going to recognize the rightful authority of Israel to exist. They were going to try to reach some kind of settlements on issues such as Sinai and a few other areas. But I just remember this because coming just barely a half a dozen years, maybe even less, after that war, never expected it to happen. But after it happened, I don't know, it's like watching a really good play. You're wondering what's going to happen next. What is the next step in the process? That there seems to be peace between Egypt and Israel. And we look at what? Another decade occurs. Nothing seems to happen. And then this gets us to the movie. Now, I remember, I remember the events clearly not as well as the Oslo Diaries depict. And of course, a lot of information was never made public to anybody at the time. But what I remember thinking about at the time, before I saw this film, saw this documentary, is wondering what drove Rabin and Shimon Peres to the bargaining table. And I'm going to want us to talk about that tonight, and for you folks to sort of give me your observations why they did this. What were their motives? Because we're not looking at, especially Rabin, as being a liberal. I know Shimon Peres was considered to be kind of a progressive. Shimon Peres was always one of those people who was more popular outside of Israel than he was in Israel. And I'll just mention, by the way, I had the pleasure of meeting Shimon Peres once. One of my former teachers retired to Jerusalem, and they were members of the same temple. And so when I was over visiting, it was kind of one of these funny stories, but she said, would you like to meet Shimon Peres? It's like, well, sure, why not? So anyhow, it was just fascinating to sort of, watch the film and see that. But one of the things I want us to think about here is and I'll be curious what your observations are, is what drove him to the bargaining table. That we have, Rabin especially, was known as a hardliner, staunchly supporting, Israel's autonomy. Why? Or what was the elixir when you were watching the film, the documentary? What was your sense about what drove him to the bargaining table? At the same time, when I was watching this, I was also curious watching it. What was sort of the motivation of Arafat? Was it basically at some point that Arafat and Rabin were just exhausted in the sense of fighting over all the years? Was there a sense in which they somehow had come to recognize that their fates were intertwined and they had to be able to reach a bargaining situation? Was it the fact that both of them were on one level considered to be extremists, or somewhat extremists or conservative for their causes, I should say that, and therefore they were in a position of being able to bargain with credibility? And I'm going to be asking you folks to tell me what you think. So as I was watching it, I was looking for clues. What brought them to the bargaining table? And I know what was, again, so fascinating about it is how all this was done kind of, surreptitiously, kind of done through back channels and so forth. So that is one thing. The second observation that I had as I was watching this is again, I still remember them coming up with what was called the two-state solution. The idea of saying that how we're eventually going to solve the issue of the Palestinians and the Israelis, or I should say the Palestinians, and Israelis, we'll say that for now, of coexisting, was basically what? The two-state solution, along with the divided Jerusalem, along with what's supposed to have been commitments for retreating back to what, pre-73 borders. And at the time, it was a fascinating solution because it was a solution that suggested not an integration of the two, of the Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis, but it was basically what? Separate states, separate autonomies for them. And part of what has really held us together, at least in fiction, for many years, is that the Oslo Accords was the solution. And even under Obama, even under Trump, there was at least lip service to that idea. What I wonder, as I was watching this video, this documentary, is the two-state solution completely dead? But two, did Israel and Netanyahu make a huge mistake in not pursuing the two-state solution? And the reason why, again, I throw out some observations on here is that if we look at the demographics of where Israel is right now, it's only a matter of time where people who are Palestinian are eventually going to be the majority of the population, in Israel. And right now, the Israeli solution, if I can call it that, for addressing the conflict within their borders is what I would argue, and it's maybe controversial, it's almost what? The separate and unequal solution. The Palestinians get Gaza. They're essentially locked into that area. They get a few other places like Jericho, Ramallah, maybe a few other areas of the East Bank that are not overly desirable. But it's a solution for segregating them. At the same time, to a large extent, a lot of the Palestinians are denied basic franchise rights. ability to vote, cast ballots, and so forth. And I wonder how long both of those solutions remain tenable. At what point can Israel still essentially maintain almost an apartheid solution for how it's addressing the Palestinian issue before non-Jewish Palestinians become the majority? Additionally, I wonder if the ability of Israel to, how I want to phrase it, if at some point it becomes untenable for them to continue to make it possible for the Palestinians to get involved politically, if they actually do get involved politically, start voting, running for office, getting involved, at what point does this dramatically change Israel in ways that Netanyahu and many of the Orthodox have not wanted to see? So again, I want to throw that out in terms of where do we see the two-state solution that, again, a generation ago, it was something that everybody thought was the right answer. Netanyahu and his party basically fought it, thinking they could forestall this and prevent that from occurring. The Trump administration essentially went along with it. I wonder if they, from their perspective, if they made a huge political miscalculation in terms of where we're headed. And then a couple of other observations I want to throw out here. And then I do want to start to sort of get you folks to start to talk here, because you don't want to just hear me talk all night. And I want to hear what you folks have to say too. Is that when I was watching the film also, what struck me was a couple of other things. One, the role that Netanyahu had very early on, at least from my perspective, and in really sabotaging, in my opinion, a lot of what Rabin and Perez were trying to do. Additionally, especially with the assassination of Rabin by what really turned out to be sort of right-wing extremists, to what extent was Rabin's assassination kind of harbinger of where world politics has been shifting in the last few years? And then another observation, again, throwing lots of questions out here, and we can develop them all here. When I watched this documentary, it was on Sunday, just as Netanyahu had been ousted from office, and a new governing coalition had taken over. And what I wonder is there the potential here now, with essentially a conservative, and it's a very conservative coalition that's in power right now? Are we at a moment where we were at back in the 90s, where it was also a conservative government in Israel, concerned about the in position of we're in that same position again? We've got Biden, who has said he's still stands behind Israel, but is facing domestic pressures in the United States to also recognize legitimate Palestinian needs. There is a desire to try to address a broader peace structure in the Middle East now that would encompass maybe redoing the Iran nuclear deal, Israel's relationship with United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and a couple of other countries, perhaps brings together and gives them some cover in a new government to be able to maybe forge a different solution. And again, I don't know whether it's the two-state solution, it's a more integrative solution. I'm not sure what. But when I watched the film, and I'm going to turn it over to you folks for some observations in a second here, I was just struck by the leadership of again, Rabin. Never a huge fan of Arafat, but I admired what he did there. And I just looked at, by the time we got to the end with the assassination, the wonder of what would have happened had he not been assassinated, and where we might be today, in the Middle East, what, a quarter of a century later. Right. So some basic observations. I got a few more questions I can throw out here, but I'm just sort of curious, for all of you here, where do you want to go in terms of your conversation? Dick, go ahead.
First of all, my apologies for not being on mute. I thought it was. I have a couple of observations, David. November 4th, 1995, I was in the car going to church in St. Paul, and an announcement came on the radio that Yitzhak Rabin had been assassinated, or at least it was a report. And I got to church and I asked the priest if I could make the announcement about it, and he said yes. That's how I learned about it. And then 2 months later, we were on a tour in Israel.
Yeah.
First time I'd ever been there. And the first place we went to in Jerusalem, the group, was to the, I think it was probably a temporary monument to Rabin. And I wish I would have a picture of it, but I remember it very vividly in my mind. And a couple of days later, we were in Jerusalem, and there was a big wall-side poster in the square there for the election of Yasser Arafat to be PLO. So that's where I got introduced to this whole business. Yeah. And I'm an admirer of Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
The other place that the movie was fascinating to me, because I spent my whole career representing teachers in a collective bargaining state in a union. So I know from lots and lots of experience how agreements come to be. So I was looking at the bargaining behaviors and how it happened to be. Bargaining is relationships, period. That's all it is.
That's right.
And pretty early on, when they get into the first negotiations in Oslo, they're just getting to know each other. And by the end, they know each other very well. And I sort of watched the whole film in the context of bargaining, which was my career. And it was just interesting to watch it. Now, what will happen, you can never totally break down relationships once they're established. Somebody starts them, it's pretty hard to break them down. And someplace along the line, I think it'll get re-energized. I think Netanyahu is portrayed in the film as a bad actor. And I think he was, my personal bias.
Yeah.
But that's where I'll start with my conversation.
Yeah. I want to add something else to this too, is that I think it was somewhere around 1997 or 1998, I was in Atlanta for American Political Science Association convention. And the keynote speaker was Jimmy Carter. Now, I mention this because for a couple of reasons. One is that on television, Jimmy Carter never came across charismatic, but I still remember this interview once with Roger Mudd. Remember, he used to be on CBS. Robert Mudd used to there. And Roger Mudd said of Jimmy Carter once, in person, Jimmy Carter was the most charismatic person you would ever expect, could ever see. And so here we are in this big auditorium in Atlanta. I can't remember where it was now. He's speaking to like 2,000 political scientists, most of whom had spent a career beating up on Jimmy Carter as a bad president. And for 90 minutes, he had us captivated, just absolutely captivated in terms of it. And we all were thinking at this point, because remember, this is like 98 or so. We're wondering who's going to run for president in 2000. We're all thinking it's got to be Jimmy Carter now. He's now proven himself. But what I was getting at is that one of the things that Carter spoke about, and it speaks to the point you were making, Dick, is he said that for years we've been inviting people to the Carter Center in Atlanta, Jordan, Syria, and he said what's fascinating is take all these different people out of the geopolitical setting, and they're all friends. He said they've developed wonderful personal relationships, and they've got common concerns about sharing water, about, I think what Laura put here, they all wanted peace. They were all exhausted about fighting. But what Carter said is he could never figure out after, the original, Camp David summit, Camp David Accords, how do you bring those personal relationships together to transcend the geopolitical positioning that they're all forced into? And that's what was fascinating about this film, is how, you're right, they built those relationships to overcome the geopolitical walls that had been built there. Go ahead, Dick. Yeah.
I just had one other observation that might be useful to the other people on the panel or on the conference. I was in the teachers union, and the first 20 years or so of my career, we were at war with a competing organization, Minnesota Education Association and Minnesota Federation of Teachers. And the last third of my career was the process to get to merger. And we merged in 1998. And again, it goes back almost totally. I was directly involved in that. It goes back almost totally to relationships. If you have relationships, it can't help but succeed. So the way you try to avoid agreements is to break down relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically my point.
Yeah. Go ahead, Patrick. Unmute yourself.
You're on mute, Patrick.
Patrick, unmute yourself.
Okay, got it. Hi.
Got it now. Got it.
Hi, good evening. I'm a retired professor of theology and philosophy. I want to begin by saying that, in my opinion, I know Jimmy Carter has been bashed a lot, but in my opinion, I think he was probably the most intelligent president in the last 100 years. Perhaps not the most charismatic, as you pointed out, David, but intelligent, absolutely. There's so many things good things that were accomplished during the Carter administration. Just an example, we wear seatbelts because of the Carter administration. And there's a long litany of successes that come out of his administration. I read his book, of course. I think, like a lot of people, I was intrigued with the two-state solution. But what I'm hearing now, what I'm reading now a lot, and just even earlier today in the Sojourners magazine, an article that said the two-state solution is gone. It's not a possibility anymore. Yeah. And the primary reason for that is because Israel has become too multi-fractured. And that is because of the Israeli settlers that are stealing homes and lands from Palestinians. That is no longer limited to just, well, the Palestinians are going to be over here in Gaza and the West Bank. Not anymore. You're talking about literally next door or across the street. It is so fractured. It doesn't appear that a two-state solution, I think we're past the point of no return on that. I don't know what the solution is, but it appears that it is not the two-state solution, that maybe that would have worked 10 or 15 years ago, 20 years ago, but that's not going to happen today.
Yeah.
And also, I wanted to add something, and after me, I would call Jack. Just getting a little behind what Patrick said. So I have friends because of my Fulbright scholarship, and so I have friends in both sides, and also have friends who have visited and spent some time. So and I think this is important for us, and there is no other way for us to know if we don't visit to the places and we don't have friends. It's hard to know. So I'm grateful that I have friends and I can have this firsthand perspective. But so a friend of mine who lives in the West Bank, so she described how they live in there. So there are walls around the cities. So it's almost like you live in a walled. It's almost like a movie thing, Escape from New York, this type of movie. So you have a wall around the city, and so in allegedly nobody can enter or go out unless they have government authorization or army authorization from Israel. The thing is, for you to be able to get that, it's very difficult. So they always find a way out. So the way out is bribing the Israeli guards that guard the gates. So it is possible to get in and get out, but upon bribery. There also, what Patrick said, it's very true. There are people who witnessed and people that live here. So we talked to them, and they witnessed Israeli people and army in Gaza, and they were just ousting families from their houses so they can just take over. And basically, they would leave the house with the kids and the clothes they were wearing. So it is interesting because we needed to have the perspective. I think it's important for us as people. We are not inside, and I think it is very dangerous for us. I hear friends, and I talk to friends. I ask questions just like yourself, David, and we had a conversation about that before. What is your side? What do you think? Do you have a perspective on that? And I think it is very dangerous that somebody comes to say, oh, I'm totally pro Israel, I'm pro Palestine. That's not exactly how it goes. I'm a human rights attorney. I can't imagine a child being guilty of anything. And we know that our children being killed in both sides. And for those who are not lawyers, and I think I will let David explain if you want, otherwise, what is defense, the right of self-defense. It's very important that we know when there is defense and there isn't. If I'm acting aggressively towards you, immediately you have the right to defend yourself and make any action and movement to protect your body and your well-being from the attack, the imminent attack. The other thing is, if I attack you, then tomorrow you throw a bomb on my house. That was not a defense. The name of this is revenge. So I think it's important because sometimes we hear this side has the right to defend, this right has the, and sometimes we don't see a defense, we see revenge. And most importantly, in my perspective, I don't see how you are defending yourself when you were killing civilians, women and children. And I don't see where, and you're free to try to convince me, but I don't see how you were taking families from the houses that you were defending yourself. So that's my small little comment. But I would like to hear Jack. Jack, if you can unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, hi, Katya. So there's been a lot of very good comments. Going back to David's introduction to the possibility of a two-state solution, as well as Patrick's skepticism over perhaps it's too late, I'd like to pose a couple of questions regarding those and go back in history, David, maybe a little further than your 1978 to 1947, when the United Nations debated the merits of a two-state solution. Actually, at the time, it was, as you know, called the partition plan. And the vote came back, I think it was like 78% in favor of a partition plan. The Jews said yes, the Arabs said no. Israel declared independence a few months later, and the next day they were at war. So one interesting question is, what would it have been like had both sides accepted that partition, which, by the way, didn't look very good on the map, but I think it looked worse for Israel than it did for the Palestinians. The second thing that comes to mind, then I want to leap through your 1978 and 1994 events and go to 2005, when Israel unilaterally left Gaza and dismantled their own populations, homes, forcefully made those Israelis leave Gaza and surrendered that territory to the Palestinians. Unfortunately, within, I think, less than a year, they elected the Hamas, who decided that the only way forward is to have the entire region be under Palestinian control, and the Jews would either go back to Europe or get killed, or maybe become a minority in that region. But that was a key, I think, opportunity for the Palestinians to have maybe not as much territory as in the partition plan in 47, certainly not as much as in the post-1967 United Nations 242 resolution, but at least the beginning of a state with a flag, with a proud democratic government that would say, here, we know how to govern ourselves and we know how to live peacefully with our neighbor. So I want to do what you did, David, is kind of pose these two questions. What would it have been like? And kind of take the debate there, maybe?
Sure. Okay. Let me throw a couple more things in here too. Follow up on this is that connect a couple things here. I think Dick's still right. It's about building relationships, but the other thing is it's about building relationships and having windows at the same time, and windows of opportunity. And again, in the dates that you're talking about, what if in 46, 47 had the Palestinians said, okay, the partition works, where would we be now? Or what if in Rabin had not been assassinated? Or the part of the film that to me hurt the most when I watched it is I had forgotten how stinking close that race was between Shimon Peres and Netanyahu. What was it like? Barely what, 0.5% or something? And I was like, oh, stink, but for, I didn't say stink when I watched it. It was a different word, but I'm cleaning it up here, but it was like that close. And it's like watching the window close or something like that. And so there's been like this, I don't know, maybe 6 windows since 1946, but we can't seem to get to yes. We can't get both sides to see that here's the window now. And that's why I'm trying to wonder now, again, following up on you here, is there a window now? Do any of you see a window opening now that we haven't seen in a long time? I don't know what the window is. I don't know what the solution is. I agree. But does anybody see one? And I do.
Yeah.
I think there's motives and interests coming together here. But do we need to have, I don't know, maybe it won't be Oslo. Maybe it'll be, I don't know, Uppsala or something like that. The Uppsala Accords where they go hide somewhere else. I don't know. Patrick.
Yes. I think there is a window, and here's one. I think there's more than one window, but here's one that I would suggest. And I want to tag on to what Kafia, is that how you, yes. What Kafia just said a few moments ago was so important. I lived and worked in Sarajevo, Bosnia for 6 years. And then I did a lot of my academic research and writing on post-apartheid South Africa. And here's one thing that I learned that was so important. And I'll put on my philosopher's cap and pose this as a question. You can answer this however you wish to. Here's the question. When is someone, Israel and Palestine, there's a lot of name calling. They call each other terrorists. The question is this: when is someone a terrorist and when is someone a freedom fighter? And I think a window of opportunity is to shift the language away from terrorist and all of the and Zionist and anti-Semitic and all those words and phrases that are very complicated and problematic. I'm probably sounding too idealistic to say, can't we all just see each other as human beings? Obviously, we're not there yet. But one window, and it's probably a small window, is to be mindful of the language. And because I think that's a terribly important question. When is someone a terrorist, and at what point is someone a freedom fighter, and who gets to determine when someone is a terrorist or a freedom fighter? Otherwise, it's just a vicious circle of language and words and names. And where does it get us?
Yeah, I want to follow up on Katja and your comments here in a couple of ways here. I think Katja made this great point about, we're viewing one side as self-defense, the other side as terrorists. But at what point, when you now, start to see civilians being killed, what was it? The AP media tower that was destroyed, full of just civilians. At what point do you have to say, which side is engaging in self-defense versus which side is the terrorist? So that's the point. But okay, this is going to be the only time in my life I will ever defend MTV on television. Okay. All right. So several years ago, I was in a hotel room for a conference. I had insomnia, and I put MTV on in the middle of the night. And it was this, and you'll see where I'm going in a second here. It was a fascinating episode. Somebody went to an NRA convention, and they started asking NRA members, do you support gun control? And they all said, no, like that. And then the person came back and said, do you support universal background checks? Is that an NRA convention? before people buy guns, or do you support what is it, like cooling off periods? And all these NRA people said, yeah, we support. That's a really great idea. And finally, this MTV person said, well, you said you're against gun control, but you support all these things. Why? And they all said, that's not gun control. That's common sense. And what it made me think about, and I've been arguing this like in terms of the gun debate in the United States, here's how I'm going to apply it here, is that both sides have gotten involved in the gun debate. They say gun control or Second Amendment. It's all about sloganeering. It's all about buzzwords. It's all about name calling. And therefore, couldn't we, if we were to change the language, how we describe what's going on, if we depicted the discussion differently, could we get beyond the established positions? And I think this is the point that Katja and Patrick, you're both making here, is that what if we change the dialogue? What if we could describe the situation differently? Could we start to create those windows in ways? And again, the point that Jimmy Carter was making, I told you when I heard him in 97, 98, he said that underneath all the geopolitical, they all share, everybody here shares common concerns about energy, about raising their kids, about wanting safe neighborhoods, about scarcity of drinking water. The commonalities are there. Mm-hmm. We just got to figure out a way of changing the way we frame it, I think.
Well, David, I like the way you described that. Who's the counterpart on the Palestinian side today to have a dialogue with?
And that's a really good question, because clearly, Arafat, at his peak probably had what? I'm going to make a guess, 70, 80% approval rating, if not more. I'm just not sure if there's a figure with the Palestinians, that has anywhere near that kind of stature or approval, that is in a position to do something like that. I mean, again, part of what I thought, what made it so interesting from the Oslo Diaries, is that in some ways, both Arafat and Rabin were arguing from positions of strength. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And here, I don't know, and again, I'm not an expert on the Middle East. I'm not an expert, on the Palestinians. But is there anybody who's got that kind of stature or strength that could eventually sell a deal? Also, yeah, Dick.
I don't have an answer to the question, but one of the things I watched the entire movie, and at the end, one of the factoids that came up, if I recall this incorrectly, let me know, was that since the breakdown in the 95 agreements, there have been 16,000 people killed in Israel, Palestine. Now that's a fairly large number of people for a place that's the size of New Jersey. And where I'm going with this is that so often we, in conversations like this, we're looking for some savior to come in, a Carter or somebody that's at the top of some pyramid, where the solution might well be down in the lower quadrant. We don't know who it is because it's an unknown person.
That's right.
Or persons. Two people having coffee together somewhere. Yeah. And that's, I think, where ultimately the solution comes. It took 20 years to get to a merger in the teacher unions. It's not unreasonable to expect it's going to take a long time, but there's constant conversations going on. And I would suspect that they're intensifying now that Netanyahu is sort of off to the side. Can we do something? But we don't know who those people are. I think there's hope.
Yeah. Well, that's why the movie was so great, because, in the beginning, it basically talks about two individuals who really had nothing to do with the government, who were kind of, I mean, I was almost waiting when the movie started. They talked about it. For those of you who are old enough to remember the movie, not movie, the television show Mission Impossible. Anybody remember that?
Yeah.
And there was always that great scene that said, something like what was that line here? The secretary will disavow any knowledge. I can't remember how that line goes like that. It's sort of, and they had, and then then the tape would burn up or something like that, or this tape will self-destruct that. I almost was waiting for like the Mission Impossible theme song to be played at that point, because these are people, you're right. These were people who, if you had said to me, select two people to go negotiate, I would not have any idea who it would have been. And so these were kind of like, I don't want to quite say unknown people, but they were kind of unknown people who emerged, who helped start to spearhead this. And so you're right. Who knows who's being picked out there or might be? I mean, I have to hope that barely a week into the new government, I'm really hoping there is some at least informal, if not more formal, outreaches that are going on at this point. I really pray. I hope there is.
Yeah, Dick, I really appreciate what you said. On one hand, right, we need a Nelson Mandela in this situation. On the other hand, we need two people sitting in a coffee shop talking. I think that's a very, very important point to highlight. Thank you.
Is Israel's politics, okay, this is another thing that I think, I can't remember who was mentioning this here. One of the things that strikes me about Israeli politics right now is that it sort of reminds me of where Italian politics was for so many years, that the system is so fragmented that you've got a whole bunch of these parties that have, like, in this case, one seat in the Knesset or two seats in the Knesset, et cetera, and you really can't build stable coalitions here. And what I'm sort of trying to think about here is this question of, is Israel so fragmented now that there isn't a way of being able to kind of knit together that conversation that you need to have? Because again, at some point there has to be, even if those two people sit at the coffee table together, is Israel just so politically polarized and fragmented, perhaps even more than the United States, that it's not even possible to do that right now? I don't know.
I would like to also remind you guys that you can ask questions.
Yeah.
Well, I'll jump in here for a sec. I have obviously been trying to figure out this solution for a long time.
Yeah.
So when you were talking both about kind of the Jimmy Carter coming early on I guess the Camp David issue, it reminded me of this book of Jimmy Carter's that he wrote in 2014, A Call to Action: Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. And I'm like, was it in that book that he was really talking about some of the solutions around women? And I do believe that the different way of framing is one around women's rights and children's rights.
Mm-hmm.
That has to be a central component to conversations, and probably the organizing peoples that need to be more on the forefront. I also, and now this was at least a decade ago, I had this vision when I was struggling because I've been involved in the program that Katya was talking about. So we've had a lot of Israeli, Palestinian, Lebanese, Egyptian, folks from the Middle East that I'm like, okay, now that you've been thinking through a human rights lens, you've got to be able to go back and solve this problem. Because on one cohort, we even had a Lebanese and an Israeli, and officially Lebanese, there's a law saying you cannot communicate with someone from Israel. So anyhow, we've had, and yet we solve problems here, but then the question is going back. So this is the decade ago, my vision, or maybe even longer. Indigenous peoples of the world need to compete in this area
Mhm.
and be a part of the solution. Because I think there has to be shifting around this now notion around decolonizing. Well, I mean, decolonization, it's a new frame, right? Or I mean, it's been talked about for decades or lots and lots of years. We know about genocide, we know about land takeovers, but I think we're in a shifting period around that language
Mhm.
of decolonization and decolonizing, and around the land. And so it's shifting around what knowledge frameworks are we using and getting out of a Eurocentric framing around land as property, and maybe even this nation state solution. I don't have the solutions completely there yet, but somehow, how can we shift the land takeover idea or that land issue to be something around community, land, climate, change? Because I remember, well, a number of fellows from all over, all of a sudden during pandemic times, they could see mountains in the distance that they'd never been able to see before.
Mhm.
And so I don't know. I guess I'm ready to find some ways that we can rethink about these and bring new players to the table so we
Yeah.
get it out of a political males network.
Yeah, I was also thinking, I was going to first say that. Well, go ahead, Mary Ellen, go ahead.
In addressing Christie's thoughts, I want to say it was probably in the early 2000s, the University of St. Thomas did a program on the Israeli-Palestine conflict. And what they introduced during that conference were exactly what you're addressing, in the sense that they talked about programs that are ongoing now between the Palestinian and Israeli people that the majority of us are not aware of. They're not
Mhm.
covered by the news because they're not political. And one of the rabbis was speaking of a program that Palestinian and Israeli families have introduced, where the children, Palestinian children, go and stay with Israeli families for a weekend and vice versa. They were finding at that point that it was an extraordinarily meaningful experience for these people, because they were now seeing families functioning together, and they were experiencing daily life in another culture. But I would venture that none of us are familiar with that particular program and programs like it that are taking place with the people. It was a very promising note for many of us to hear, because it wasn't in the newspapers. It wasn't any part of peace discussion. It was rather people saying, we need to bypass the political process. We need to build on our own individual and collective relationships, be with each other as human beings, as families, and it will give us a better understanding of who we are and who we can be. So I think there are some of those programs in place. How long they're continuing on, I would venture to guess that they're probably still continuing in one form or another. And I find that very, very heartening.
Yeah. Mary Ellen, your comments remind me of another story. Again, the first time I went to Jerusalem, the people who I were with, again, were a lot of my a lot of them were my former teachers. I went to a particular restaurant, and I swear that everybody I knew in the world walked by that corner that day. But a year later, I went back to Jerusalem for again another conference. But there was a reporter in the Twin Cities who had interviewed me, and she was Palestinian, and her family still lived back, in sort of the Palestinian, part of Jerusalem. And she said, "Would you like to meet my family when we go back and go visit them?" And I said, "Sure, it'd be great." And so the reason why I mention it is that I saw two different parts of Jerusalem 2 years apart. But the thing that I saw in both cases when I talked to lots of people is, and this is the point that I think that Christy and Mary Ellen are making, is when I talked to just average people about what your concerns were, they were concerned about what? Raising their kids, safe neighborhoods, schools. I think this is Katja's comment also too here. It's kind of like what the everyday existence of how do you just sort of raise a family, and produce the next generation. And I always remember that because I think there are commonalities out there with everyday people. How do we get those to become the front and center? I think is what the three of you have been talking about here. Again, to me, maybe I think too much like a political scientist in the sense of thinking, what are the incentives? How do we get people to the table? How do we get people to have their perspectives heard? So that's what I keep wondering is how do we change that language? How do we get people to realize that the people across the walls or across the neighborhoods in Jerusalem have a lot more in common than we actually think they do? And again, I'm not smart enough to figure the answer to these questions out. Bri, I think you had your hand up for a while there too.
Barat.
I like to listening to this all evening and having just seen the film before this program. I'm kind of reminded of several experiences I've had. And I just want to share one or two of that. And this one relates to my being in Bombay. I'm from India and I live here, and I was also a professor and all of that. So I went for conferences in India and things like that. Anyway, so I was there one time, and Bombay was my hometown, so I knew lots of people. And one of the new people I got to know was the counselor in Mumbai from Israel. He was a very nice man. And it turns out that I was at a party and was having a very engaging conversation with an Israeli woman who turned out to be the counsel's wife. And she said, we're going to have a get together next week. Would you like to come? And I said, sure. So I went there and got to know some of the Mumbai internationalists that they had invited and so on. And, nobody talked about Israel-Palestine at that social gathering. But as the gathering ended, a few of us kind of was there. We just didn't leave. We were just having very engaging conversation, and I was kind of a new catch over there in that I kind of solely represented America, even though since I lived here and so on. And they were all very interested in about US point of view on this Middle East and so on. Anyway, so we got into talking, and I remember asking him, I said, look, Israel, with all the immigrants who have come in there, all the exchanges you have with the Western world and technology and science and all of that, and you look at your neighborhood, Palestine and so on. I mean, they're so deficient in all that. Can't you share it with them? I mean, you could be a really someone who can provide them with the kinds of things that's going to meet their needs, rather than trying to militarily block any kind of opening and scare, being scared about it. what shocked me was what this council guy says. He says, you know, we Israelis think that way too. Unfortunately, our leaders who run our country don't. And he says, we also feel that, you know, we could be such good neighbors because we can do so many things to help them. Like water is a big issue, you know, with the drought, and agriculture is a big issue. Palestine has so much land there, a lot of it is barren and so on. But we have to share, we have to recognize that this is our common, you know, heritage. And he was just, he says, you know, I'm so happy I have a post in Mumbai because I find it very sad to be living in Israel, being part of the government when we are not doing what we could easily do and not have to live with this constant conflict. Now, maybe he was an exception, but I was very happy to see that, you know, that kind of a sentiment was there. And then, of course, what Christy talked about and what Mary Ellen afterwards followed are really the kinds of things that if we could do, you know, we'll have a community and then have some kind of a respect for, you know, each side. Now, I also want to make a comment on this idea of, you know, who do you negotiate on the Palestinian side? Well, I have a sort of a strange feeling that if you put out the right kind of signals, it's amazing how easily, you know, response comes out. And oftentimes it comes out in very surprising ways. And so that's, I'll stop there. And I just want to add one other thing. You know, I'm really happy that we have in our country right now, not Trump, but Biden, okay? I want to be very clear about it. And, I think, you know, India has been very interested in creating good relations with its neighbors. And India is a very troubling neighbor up north, which is a big giant called China. And so there's a real issue in India on how to deal with because they don't want to have a fight. Well, for one thing, India will lose if they had a fight. And the other thing is that there's so many common things. So it's a kind of a interesting game going on there in trying to be compatible with each other and yet have conflicts that coming up. And now we see the same thing, and Biden is bringing it up, that we similarly have that conflict on a much larger scale in the world. The conflict between democracies and between, you know, totalitarianism. And so I think this offers, just as with Jimmy Carter and just as to some extent with Bill Clinton, I think this offers President Biden a fantastic opportunity to, you know, play that catalytic role. Because I don't think either Israel, even with all its strength, and of course, Palestine is so weak. You know, the Palestinian, they're kind of broken, they're not united, they don't, you really need someone to kind of bring them together and create that kind of, you know, at grassroots level as well as from the top. And it may require some meaningful commitment on the part of United States. And the nice thing about United States now is that they've gotten Europeans to become partners in everything. Again, so it doesn't have to be just US thing. So we won't have to worry about Republicans challenging, you know, Biden doing it if it is done sort of internationally by the Western Bloc.
Maybe what the Palestinians are missing is Gandhi.
Sorry?
Maybe what the Palestinians are missing is someone like Gandhi.
Well, that's my third story that I was going to share. And this happened a few years ago. It happens that one of our good friends in Minnesota was a Palestinian, and her brother was very much part of the inner circle of Arafat. So, you know, we used to get some information about post-Arafat years, what is happening in Palestine, you know, like in the last 15 years ago or something, 10 years ago. And I remember having this conversation because they keep having this infidada, you know, infidada, okay. You know, and they're gonna fight. And I remember telling Noah, I said, Noah, you know, it's no use fighting. I mean, don't have enough weapons. You know, how many people are going to die? Why not just walk? Just walk there, you know, instead of shooting arrows and guns and things like that. Just walk.
Mhm.
How much are they going to, you know, you're saying this is your homeland, you know, you grew up here, your home was stolen away, and a lot of their home was stolen away. And they still have some relatives who live nearby. I said, just walk. Anyway, to me, that's a Gandhi way. Okay.
I want to throw in a different idea just for a second here and tell me what you think. For so many years, the folk wisdom was that in order to achieve peace across the Middle East, Palestine and Israel had to basically resolve, that issue had to be resolved first. What I'm starting to wonder now is the key to the solution between the Palestinians and Israel now a broader Middle East peace agreement instead? Because think about, let's just sketch out some scenarios, and Christy's shaking her head on this one. You know, imagine a scenario. I mean, right now we know Israel and Saudi Arabia view Iran as a common threat. And they've kind of sort of formed this really interesting alliance here. What if the United States, European Union, and it could get something that could buy in with, let's say, let's list that group for now, a renewal of the Iranian nuclear deal as a preface to what? A broader peace agreement, you know, within the Middle East. What I wonder is if that's where the direction we're going now, does that change the calculus between Israel and the Palestinians, or some deal where we work out something that brings in what? Iran, Syria, and so forth. So I guess I'm wondering now, are we at a point, and I don't know what it looks like here, have we inverted the traditional folk wisdom? The old folk wisdom is solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that's the gateway to the Middle East. Do we have to now be thinking about what? A broader Middle East approach in order to be able to resolve this issue? What do the rest of you think about that?
I think you have a point. I do think that's a good way to segue out of the. It's very hard to keep coming back to the same.
Right.
You know, you have to kind of switch. I see Patrick has a.
Yes, I think that that one broader issue that can be addressed in the Middle East and in the world is that of religion. And I want to share with you briefly, and I promise to make it brief, an experience that I had in Sarajevo after the Dayton Peace Accord was signed in Dayton, Ohio in 1995. Sarajevo was shattered in every sense of the word. It was destroyed, the infrastructure, the electricity, the bridges, the water. It was a mess. And the hatred was very intense. And for 2 years after that, the three religious leaders of Sarajevo, the Catholic Archbishop, the Archbishop of the Orthodox Church, and the head imam refused to sit down at the same table to talk about reconciliation. They would not sit down. That's how deep the division was. So do you know how that was solved? Sarajevo has a small synagogue, a very old synagogue. Now, at that time, they did not have a rabbi. They were so small they didn't have a rabbi. They had a cantor. And I forget the gentleman's name. I spoke with him at a conference once, a lovely man, and he just kept at it for 2 years, talked to the Catholic Archbishop, the Archbishop of the Orthodox Church, the head imam. And he said to me, and he finally, after 2 years, he got them to sit at the same table. And I said, how did you do that? I mean, I'm surprised you didn't give up, but how did you do it? And his response was, well, like a good Jew, I just pestered them until they said, okay, we'll sit down and talk. But, you know, I mean, it's a cute story, but it's also a very sad story. When you have the 3 religious leaders not willing to sit at the same table, that was a very disturbing reality. And so I bring this back to the one again, is David, as you said, window of opportunity. Another window of opportunity is to have interfaith, interspiritual, and intercultural dialogue at every level. And you know what? If the leaders won't do it, then we meet one another in the coffee shop. The hell with the leaders. I live in Cincinnati, and we have a very conservative archbishop here, not a progressive, not a leader. And many of us just say, well, you know, the hell with him. We're going to get things done with race relations and everything else. And sometimes that's what has to happen. It has to come from the bottom up. And I think that's what Christy was suggesting earlier. Is I love what you said, Christy, about the kind of the decolonization and getting away from the, you know, that Eurocentric model. That's so spot on. Thank you.
And if I could add, I had the opportunity in my life to have, I had different opportunities myself or see other people in different roles, which started giving me ideas of how to solve problems in the world. And I think I had the opportunity to discuss this with Christy, sometimes with Mary Ellen, and some of you, and David. So first of all, I still think that education is the most important thing. Christy is an educator, David is an educator, Mary Ellen. I feel that sometimes we miss big opportunities, and certainly many of our governments, when they do not invest in education as much as they should. And I do believe in the human rights education. I'm making a little marketing for you, Christy, but I do believe that's so true with all my heart, the necessity of people understanding what human rights is and what human rights entails, because talking to people anywhere randomly, they don't know. They don't know really. And so it's very interesting. The other day I was giving a training another area, and so when they ended, they said, I didn't know that I had this right. And it's very interesting how people are not aware. And they also said, I didn't know that this was a human right. So it is very interesting how sometimes it's a basic right and they are not aware. So I do believe that we need to actually have this conversation going and find ways of getting the human rights education to the world, even, and not depend as much of the government. And that comes my second point. I don't think that our governments, and I say overall in different countries, I come from another country, I don't think they really represent everything that we want. And of course, they will, as they are elected, they come in the right, they are from the left, they are from center. So there is always somebody that is not represented in the government. And it's not that I agree with that, but this is the truth. This is the reality. I believe that considering this, that is a truth in our current world, we as concerned citizens have to step up and create hubs of discussion. That leads me to my third point. So this that we have right now is a hub, and it's just a modest hub, but it is one. And I do believe that this gives opportunities for us, multiple opportunities in this case, because we have this type of conversation every month, gives us the opportunity to reach people and to talk about things that are important. It's, you know, it's not only important the thing that happened in our city hall here in this city. You know, we are in different cities, we come from different countries, everything is important. We, you know, we live in the globe is ours. If the globe is over, our lives are over. So I think that's important we keep that conversation. And my fourth point is I had the opportunity when I was younger to participate in exchange programs. So in my case, I did a Rotary international exchange program, which was marvelous. But then when I was older, I did my Fulbright. David did 3 Fulbrights, because why to have one if you can have 3? And and there are so many, hundreds in the world, exchange programs that give people the opportunity to go to another city, another state, another country, and live that culture and learn how they live, what they eat, how they pray, what they believe, how they feel about the same things that you see. And so it gives me back the connection of what Patrick was saying. And I learned about the same program that you mentioned, Patrick, of groups calling, you know, Palestinians hosting Israelis and vice versa for the weekend. Because it's hard, for example, for a big organization to actually host exchange programs and take, you know, a Brazilian to Syria, you know, to take a French to spend some time in, I don't know, in another country, in Israel or in Gaza. So the parents will not allow. So there are many countries who are in civil war right now, and they don't have a possibility of international exchange programs because it's a serious consideration. So they can't. But these small communities, they have the possibility to do that. And if we have this idea to share with them, and even in these small groups that we have friends all over, and if we can feed the ideas and you know, even help if we can, because today we have Zoom, we have Skype, FaceTime. I think this is not impossible. So when you, David, ask, is it possible? What can we do? This is my small little contribution. I know that there is no creativity. I'm just trying to compile in 5 minutes what I think have been amazing ideas, have been tested, and they can be used for everything, you know, including for us to remove our personal bias, because everybody has bias, And it's important for us to remove them. And sometimes for you to remove, you need to spend time with the enemy. I hate to do that, but I did. But sometimes you need to have that experience, and I think that's important. But I wanted, before to give Dave, because we're getting in the end of our, it's one of the longest that we did. So I apologize for you guys, but I love that you stayed to the end. Before I give to David opportunity for his last remarks for tonight, I would like to give some information to share some information with all of you. So this organization is called the Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota. We have few programs that we do. This is the global films discussion, where we discuss movies based in true stories and or documentaries that are of global interest, and they are always in the third Thursday of each month. We also have a human rights forum, and this month our human rights forum is about the racism in the United States. The date of our forum is going to be a Wednesday, June 30. It's going to be at 6 p.m. Central Time. Zoom, cost-free, open to everybody. Our guest speaker is the wonderful attorney, Latoya Burrell. If you are interested, please go to our website, register, attend, ask questions. Please keep in touch with us. You know that you attended, you have our emails. Please keep in touch with me. I will be sending you a thank you note afterwards. This event was filmed and will be posted in our YouTube channel, and it's going to be in our website as well. Please go back and share and watch again. And please keep coming and keep attending, because we need you for the success of our events. With that, I will thank everybody for coming, and I will give David Schultz, our wonderful guest speaker, to have the opportunity for the last remarks.
Okay, my last remark is very brief. I want to sum up what we talked about tonight, and I think I can do it in about 2 or 3 sentences. And I think what some of us, I think, concluded tonight is what? New faces create the opportunity for new relationships, which create the opportunity for new windows of opportunity. And maybe that's the way to summarize it for tonight.
That's
good.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
David, thank you so very much. We appreciate
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Words.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Thank you
Katya.
so much, very much, for everybody who attended. Please keep in touch and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you.